Friends, you are in for such a treat today. Aundi Kolber is here with me on the GoodHard Story podcast. And if for some reason you do not know who she is a professional counselor and the author of Try Softer and Strong Like Water, which is such a great title. And she is especially trained in trauma and body-centered therapies and passionate about the integration of faith and psychology, which I love so much. As I just told you, I'm like a huge mega fan of Kurt Thompson, Dan Ziegelson, and I just think, yeah, your field is so important and healing and just so cool. So I'm just so thankful that you're here. And goodness, I would love to start just by hearing. I mean, there's just so many things I want to ask you about, but Strong Like Water just has to be the question out of the gate. What a title. What a concept. I would love for you to kind of unpack the title a bit, if you would. I have lots of thoughts on about it because I couldn't have water for the first year after the stroke. I couldn't have any liquids, and I craved water so deeply. So just there's this very visceral, maybe in my nervous system, you can talk about why, responding to even the words strong like water. It's very deep. And anyway, you tell me about the title.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for having me. It's such an honor. And this title, I love titles that make you pause a little bit. Like, my book, Try Softer, and then Strong Like Water. I love it. I think that sometimes when we put things together that sometimes feel like a paradox, oftentimes it, in my experience, sort of opens us up to maybe like almost a truer truth that tends to come out in the tensions. And so Strong Like Water, there's so much I could say, but I think a couple of things. The first is that, for me growing up, part of my history is that I am a survivor of complex trauma from my childhood. And part of my story is that I always heard how strong I was. Oftentimes, really, that was one of my primary coping skills in the world often looked really good, socially. Like people kind of, there was sort of this sense, this attitude, like Aundi will be fine, right? Like even if someone had a sense of what was going on in my family, I think because of how I was adapting, my body was doing her best to find a way through this, but it just happened to look like a little bit more socially acceptable or praised. But a lot of that for me, what I came to learn later when I had more safety and space to access my story, was that a lot of that was rooted in trauma responses.
Interesting.
And so for me, the word strong, for a lot of my life, I've had an ambivalence towards the word strong, because I sort of had this feeling like, I don't want to hear how strong I am. I don't want to be strong, And yet part of my story has been also coming, and really this is not just my story, but as I've worked with clients and done, as a therapist, as a trauma therapist, really coming to honor how our bodies adapt to hard things. And the way God designed us to be able to do that is in many ways, I think, a miracle. And so Strong Like Water is my attempt. It's really like the fruit of my own wrestling with this idea of both the grief, I think, of sometimes like how we have to be strong, but then also this idea that I think that God invites us to a deeper, more expansive strength as we are able, as we have the support, as we have the resources. And so Strong Like Water, I think water is this deeply adaptable. I mean, I think, on one hand, water can seem like nothing, like a drip. And then on the other hand, you look at water that created the Grand Canyon, or water that can take down entire ships,
Right.
or
A
water.
tsunami. Yes.
Yeah, there's so much power
Yeah.
in water.
Right.
And so I wanted to convey in that title, that's a long way to say, I wanted to convey in that title that there is an expansive way
Mm.
for us to be strong, and that we can honor the full spectrum
Mm-hmm.
of how God designed us.
I love it. Of course, it's incredibly appropriate for the Good Hard
Mm.
Story podcast that there's both. There's always both. There's an expansive strength in our stories. I have a book entitled Suffer Strong. So I love the notion of suffering with strength. And I have heard you talk about so beautifully that strength is not a grin and bear it deal. The whole notion of buck up and grit your teeth isn't it. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, truly could not agree more. I've lived it. That it's yes, something different. I'd love for you to unpack that a bit, if you will.
Yeah. Well, thank you for highlighting that. And I think, you know, part of what I talk about in the book is that sometimes, in the absence of what we need, we do grin and bear it, right? But or white knuckle, or
Right.
find this way. But that kind of experience leaves such a deep mark on us. And that there's a sense in which I'm glad our bodies can do that. But that the truest strength, and really what I hope that this is where I think it opens the door, because I think our culture, this is my personal, if there was like a tiny little pedestal that I could get upon
Yeah, yeah.
and talk about, is that this is where I think our culture, and perhaps even in Christian culture, I think this is where we get it wrong, is that we have this very narrow view
Yeah.
of strength. And we say,
Right.
man, you know what? If you're going to be strong, the only way to be strong is to stuff your feelings. Don't name how hard it is. Don't ask for help. Don't do any of those things, because that minimizes the strength. And I believe that, in life or death situations, sure, sometimes that's what we have to do. But what we are meant for, what God designed us for, is that deeper. And I think probably what you're talking about is that access to something that like the mystery that holds us even in the pain, right? And the connection and the people and the care and the ability for our body to metabolize feelings, all of those things are sources of strength, but we generally don't see it that way. And oftentimes, I think for me, particularly as a therapist, one of the things that tends to fire me up a little bit is I see folks who've done so much work to get to a place where they can really do some work to heal. And they get into therapy, and part of what happens is they have this internalized story that it's weak to let themselves accept help, or to feel their feelings, or to lean into those things.
Yeah.
And that's where I think sometimes we get it wrong.
I could not agree more. I think it's fascinating that God has so clearly wired us with strength, clothed us in strength, and yet we really make a mess of what he's done, honestly. And it takes a lot of unpacking what true strength looks like. I've heard you talk about this notion of emotional flexibility. And I don't know if I coined the phrase, but I talk a lot about emotional agility, which is the same thing, but
Mhm.
this notion of you can pivot and be
Mm.
flexible in life. And it has been to my great gain to do that. Just
Mm.
go with that, and just a kind of a more relaxed, flexible, agile approach to life. And you talk a lot about that, I think,
Mm.
with your clients. And how does emotional flexibility play into trauma
Mm.
survivors in particular?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love and am so grateful for the way that you talk about that, because I think, um, you know, part of moving towards that more expansive strength, I think really requires, as we're able, that ability to be with a wide range of experiences, sensations, and feelings in our body.
Hmm.
And there's no way to do that when our body is staying in this very rigid place. Now, again, I think the rigidity has its time and place, in the sense that, when we are in the midst of something really harmful or dangerous, sometimes that's the thing that
Oh,
split second decision, our brain, our body goes, boom, that's unsafe, do this thing. And we do it without even a
right.
conscious thought.
Yes.
And the healing comes as we access those spaces, those people, those moments, those experiences of God, where our body can settle enough to where what begins to happen when we have that experience of settling, I think of it a lot like, a part of it, it's softening, right? And
Mm.
again, if we think about water, it's like water in its most rigid state is ice, right? And
Yeah.
ice is like H2O as ice. That's strong. Like that can do some things, but
Mm.
it's not very flexible, right? It sort of has one job.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's just hard. But as that melts, it softens, right? And then it begins to be able to gain that capacity that we so often think of as how water is flexible. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
similarly, like that's like us a little bit. Our nervous system, as we have that capacity, we then are able to be like, just like what you name here in your podcast, like the good, the hard, like even that tension requires a certain flexibility.
Yes.
And it's not always, and the ability to begin to access that, I would say, is evidence of the healing work.
Hmm.
That liminal space where we can begin to honor that, is evidence of the fact that our body actually probably is experiencing some safety. I don't celebrate people's hard, but
Right.
what I do celebrate is that God designed us with these different capacities to survive and
Mm.
ultimately to heal. And that healing might look different than where we started, and it might be a reimagining, but these things in us, like I think of our bodies like we are like these entire universes of possibilities within us. And so as we come out of this rigidity of like, oh, strength only looks like this, or there's only one way to heal, or there's only one way to look at these things, I think it opens us up to this possibility of a deeper flourishing. And so to go back to your original question, I think that emotional flexibility and ultimately really even nervous system flexibility
Mm-hmm.
is this gift that we have that allows us, when Jesus talks about, I came that they may have life and have it to the full.
Right.
To me, like fullness means we can feel and be the full spectrum of who God made us to be. And that requires a level of flexibility.
That's so good, so beautiful, and so true. I'm always longing to feel all the feels, to not be a fully flourishing human who doesn't elevate emotion or suppress emotion, but lives in a tension of all the feels. I love how you talk about the flow of strength, and I would love for you to share that with our listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so the flow of strength is really, it's my attempt to put words to this idea that we can be expansive. Because I think the question is like, if strength isn't just this little rigid way of, this pretending, disconnecting, suppressing, what is it then? And so the flow of strength is a way that I sort of imagine it to be this spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum is what I call situational strength. And situational strength is what we classically think of as sort of like the life or death sort of reactions that we have in our body, like fight or flight, maybe up like that frozenness or potentially dissociation, which is a form of disconnection that our bodies automatically go to when the threat feels too big. And all of these things, a lot of them are actually happening below our consciousness. So this is an important note. And I think because I've worked with so many trauma survivors who have so much shame about the way their bodies have reacted, or potentially the ways that even still they carry the imprints of trauma, I really like to highlight the fact that, as we bring some compassion and curiosity and attention to these experiences, we can bring them into our awareness. But many of our reactions, much of our situational strength, lies below the surface. And every single person, even if you're not a trauma survivor, has this. Like, if a common example I use is that, if you are trying to cross the street and you see a car out of the corner of your eye, your body will do the best that they can to get out of the way of that car as quickly as possible without a conscious thought. And that is so good. I'm so glad our bodies do that, right?
Right.
But as our body perceives, we have enough safety. And literally that means like on a neurobiological level. Like that might be noticing, that the people that we're with, we notice their body language and their posture, and we can sense that they're calm. It might be that we're scanning the environment and we see that everything's okay. Or, in that example with the car, it's like after you almost get hit, that realization that didn't happen is a cue of safety. So what begins to happen is that an important part of our brain comes back online called our prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex, it goes offline when we are in survival mode. And when it comes back online, it gives us the ability to observe what's going on in our body without getting lost in it. So we might have this experience of like, oh, I'm noticing that I feel sad about this thing, but I can recognize that I am not the thing. Like I am not the sadness. I am not the trauma that happened to me. I can pay attention to that and I can care for it, but there's a difference. And as we get to this space called transitional strength is what I call that. This is where lots of really beautiful things happen, because this is where we begin to feel like we have some choice. Like we begin to feel like we can reach out for help. Or this is oftentimes in therapy where we might begin to talk about somebody's experience, or we might be able to do some body-centered work to help them tune into the sensations of their body. And so what we're doing is we're helping to give safety to that experience so our body can continue to sort of process it. And as that happens, our body naturally and intuitively moves that experience through our body, and we ultimately move towards what I call integrated strength. And that's on the furthest side of the flow of strength. And this is this place where, like again, with the example with the car, it's like, oh man, I almost got hit.
Yeah.
Then I notice it didn't happen. I'm safe. My body is like processing the experience, allowing the adrenaline to move through. And then at the end, finally, I take a sigh and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I should look both ways next time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that whole experience is an example, like we're moving through that flow of strength. And once we've moved through, we can learn from what we've experienced. We can gain insight from it. And ultimately, it might even be something in the future where we might come back to it and be like, oh yeah, I got through that in the past. I could probably get through that again.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of that, of make a memory and remember and wake up to the journey that you're on. People are just so asleep. This is such a fascinating discussion. I have heard you speak about the window of tolerance. And for those who may be unfamiliar with this term, can you briefly explain what you mean by it and how does it help people move along the flow of strength that you just chatted about?
Yeah. So the window of tolerance, I know you mentioned you love Dr. Dan Siegel, which yes, I share that love. So the window of tolerance is was coined by him, and it's this range of arousal where we can feel our feelings or have an experience in our body. We could have a memory, and our body is able to essentially tolerate it. Like we still feel like ourselves, and the systems of our body that allow us to like metabolize an emotion, for example, like all of those stay online. And this is a really good thing because basically we have the capacity to be most like ourselves in this space, and we can learn and we can connect with people. We tend to be the most creative. I often think of this like it's also the space from a faith perspective where I think we have a really the best opportunity to interface with God, not because God's not present in other places, but because we have the better eyes to see. Because we're not in survival. And so it's a special place in our experience to be in that window of tolerance. But when our body perceives we are experiencing a danger that is significant enough, we will begin to move out of that window. And we will first move into either like sort of our sympathetic nervous system, or sometimes we might think of this as hyperarousal, or even, fight or flight. There's an energy to the sympathetic nervous system. There's a sense of like, we are trying to mobilize to neutralize the threat. And that can even come, there's another trauma response called fawning, which is when we over accommodate or give people what they want. We walk on eggshells, but it's rooted in trying to neutralize a threat.
Interesting.
So this is where our body generally, according to what's called polyvagal theory, this is where we go first. This is where we try to resolve the threat. But if our body perceives it's not going to work, and this happens often very quickly without a conscious thought, if it's like, oh, none of these things will help, we will then drop down into what's called dorsal vagal, or sort of a dissociation or a freeze, a disconnection. And there's actually a whole spectrum even within dorsal. But what I think is important to understand is that the role of dorsal is that it's trying to help us conserve our energy. Our body has decided this threat is too big. And so it's sort of like pulling the e-brake on a car. It's like the regular brakes aren't working. our body is sort of perceiving like hope is lost is how it feels to our body. And so it's like, we got to like pull that e-brake and like do whatever we can. And so in this space, we might feel like depressed or numb. We might start to feel like we're watching ourselves, all the way. If the threat is significant enough, folks could even lose consciousness. And this can happen, sometimes like in terms of, things like sexual violence, or it's just the threat feels so big. So this whole spectrum is important to understand, because when I mentioned that different type of strength, that situational strength, anything outside of that window of tolerance is situational strength. So this is all the ways our body tries to help us stay safe when we perceive that a threat is really significant. Mm-hmm. Now, what's I think sometimes confusing for folks is that sometimes people go to these places even when to the outside person, they're like, but you were at the grocery store. Like you're just picking up some cereal, right? And what's important to understand is that when we have, and there's lots of nuance to this, but generally speaking, when we have unresolved trauma that lives in our body, if our body perceives, and this is an important piece, that something is threatening, even maybe to other people it doesn't appear that way, we may still go to out of our window, or we might go to that situational strength. And so the key here, and that second part of your question is how does that help us move along that flow of strength?
Yeah.
Well, I think first, one of the things I would say is, I hope maybe for folks who are listening, if you're hearing this and you resonate, my hope, the reason I'm so passionate about always teaching this piece, is I hope that maybe it sparks some compassion in you when you hear how your body is designed. Like that it's not trying to be difficult. Like this is not just a hassle, right? That our body is truly designed to keep us safe, and so does their best. And that oftentimes it's actually the absence of the resources and the safety that's missing. And so the thing that allows us to move along that flow of strength is to begin to access what I call compassionate resources. And sometimes that's as simple as noticing like the here and now by using like our 5 senses, because trauma takes us out of the here and now, or when our body experiences that level of threat, and it can make us disoriented.
Oh gosh, for sure. I can get a phone call, I will not name from who, or a text message, and I can literally be frozen by a person in my life that is difficult.
Yeah.
And I know that feeling where you can't really think thoughts, but you're not there anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so often, again, when we go back to how we typically think of strength, we think like the way it's typically been defined is just like, oh, well, but just power through, right? But this perspective turns it on its head. And what it helps us to understand is like, no, our body is experiencing a threat so significant that what's needed is not more willpower, but in those experiences, more safety. Because that is that key to that emotional flexibility, to that nervous system flexibility that we named, because that's what's happening, right? As we move along that flow of strength, is that like water, we can flow. As we sort of have what we need to flow, right? And I think that's why God designed us with such a need for connection,
Right.
with such a need for care, for such a need, like it's so deeply ingrained in us to have that in part because that's also the pathway to healing.
Right. Goodness. I feel like one of the things that our ministry gets to really be about is creating spaces of belonging where people
Mm.
feel they truly belong. And you have spoken about how people will trade
Mm.
belonging for authenticity. Is that right? Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is so incredibly toxic.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
right? I'd love for you to speak to that, if you will.
Yeah, well, so I love the work of like Dr. Gabor Mate. He has a beautiful quote. He is a trauma specialist from Canada. He's done a lot of work, but a lot of how I've talked about this particular subject is inspired by his work around it, because he talks about the ways that people have two main needs: authenticity and belonging. And when authenticity threatens belonging, like when being who God made us to be threatens belonging, we will trade belonging for authenticity, meaning we will sometimes seek to be included, even if it means we can't honor who
Who we
God
are.
made us to be,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And so I love to hear you say that desire of creating those spaces where we can come as who we are and who God made us to be. Because ultimately, again, as a survival skill, many people, and I often work with trauma survivors, but I think there's different versions of this in different spaces, right? That many of us are aware of this feeling. Like, it's that classic feeling like, well, if I just say the right thing, then I will belong, but it will cost me something. And the thing it will cost me, often I even think of it as close to integrity, right? Like if I'm not being who God made me to be, it also eats at this internal core sense of alignment
Yeah.
with what I believe to be true and what God has taught me to be true, right? And so creating those spaces, and even as we think about this conversation, is like that's a buffer, right? Where there's going to be lots of spaces in the world where we won't belong. And I think there's no way for us to sort of fix all of that. But what we can do, and what you are doing, right, is creating those spaces that are like, it's like a safe place to land.
Right.
Because even having those small spaces where, I think on a nervous system level, the way I often think of it is like, where are those places where you can fully exhale? Where your body is able to fully and finally just settle.
Right, totally. My friend Heather Avis calls it the shoulders down places. Your shoulders are
Mm,
down. Totally.
yeah, yes. Because our body's always speaking, right? Our body is telling the truth about the joy and the pain of our life, right? And sometimes, again, because we want to belong, we'll say, "Oh, no, 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 I'm fine. I'm totally fine." But internally, we're wound up so tight, or we're so disconnected from ourselves because our body's telling the truth, right? And as we have that ability to lean in with compassion and to lean in with curiosity to say, "Oh, okay, what is my body saying about this space? And what is my body saying about the sense of belonging I have?" I think we get this deeper, sort of temperature check. And I'm so passionate about encouraging folks and encouraging Christians to, we have an incarnational God,
Right.
right? A God who fully lived in a body. And
Right.
so, because I think so often we have learned not to honor or listen or attune to the body.
Right.
And that is a huge that's a huge piece, right?
Right.
Because the
Yeah.
body will tell us what our bodies actually need.
Right. That's very beautiful. The body keeps score. I've heard it before.
That's right.
And yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, how many times does some miscommunication even or something really small make your stomach hurt or make your
Mm,
just instant body response almost before you even think the thought, your body responds to what's happening, and of course it does.
yeah.
Wow, this has been fascinating. I could probably talk to you for like 5 hours, and I really want like some personal sessions for healing. To my knowledge, I haven't suffered much great trauma except nearly dying of a stroke, but I got plenty of issues, in all the realms. So
Mm.
I do need some. I actually do have a wonderful counselor in Atlanta, but if I were in Michigan, I would come to you. And
Mm,
I'm just so grateful for your work, for
mm,
Try Softer. Goodness, I
mm.
want to read that now. It's on my list. And Strong Like Water. Are they both available wherever books are sold so our listeners can get them?
Yes, yes. Well, first, thank you for your kind words, and I do want to honor the significance of your story, because that absolutely, speaking of the way the body, holds a story and keeps a score.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
honor that, and just thank you so much, because I am so grateful to have this conversation. And yes, those books are available wherever books are sold.
Oh, well, wonderful, Aundi. And listen, I asked every guest on the podcast this question.
Mm,
What is good in your story? What is hard in your story? And how do you live into the tension of both those things at the very same time? Because as we know,
mm,
it's always both. Nothing is one note. Things are
mm.
always good and hard at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what an important question. Well, I think the good in my story, there's a psalm that I love, and it's I remain confident of this.
Hmm.
I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And that has been a really important like anchor for me. This last year has been, for multiple reasons, deeply challenging. But I have had the opportunity, like in my family, like with my kids and my husband, to be able to live a reparative experience to so much that was really painful in my childhood, and to be able to offer my kiddos some things that I would have never dreamed to be able to have the capacity to offer that. And that is for me like the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living.
Wow, yeah.
um, and the heart is that, I, having been a survivor of complex trauma, there are multiple ripples from that. There are waves that, it's not one thing, there are many, many things. And so that's something that I have to live, what I teach. And that is both very difficult, and yet in many ways I'm grateful to, I have deep compassion for folks I work with, because I know how hard this work is.
Mm, that is so beautiful and so true. Hopefully, in all of our stories, I hope that's my story too. Is it leads me to a place of deeper compassion,
Mm,
and what a better place to land than true, real compassion. So,
mm,
what a gift, Andy, this has been. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. You are just a gift to this
mm,
world.
mm. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you are so welcome. God bless you.